Okay, so I would like to wish a warm welcome to Eileen Mills and her team from Newcastle University. And these researchers are working in modelling, evidence and policy research group, and they specialise in understanding systems through data analysis and modelling. And their research themes cover a range of human-wildlife conflicts and include prioritising invasive alien species impacts and their management. And their role in the RSU project, it's been a long road, Eileen, but we've done it. Their role in the RSU project is to collate and analyse the coordinated trapping and shooting data, all this good work that you've been collecting, and analyse the temporal and spatial patterns to inform future management. And the group also run a master's course in wildlife management. And Esther, who's going to be talking today, is an international student completing her research project for this degree, analysing the volunteer input to the RSU project. Thank you, Eileen.
Super, thank you very much for the introduction. Oh, is that better? Okay for noise? Closer? Like that? How's that? Is that better? Better, super. Okay, thank you for the introduction, and also thanks to the previous speakers, because you've given me wonderful context for the talk that we're going to go through today. We're going to look at the RSU project and the contribution that it's making to IAS management and our understanding of invasive species management. And as Mariella said, it'll be both me summarising the RSU work and also Esther talking about her master's project. So just to summarise the talk that Steve gave on the need for IAS management, we have international policy legislation and guidelines of what the need is from a country level to respond to the threat of invasive alien species. And we know that prevention is best. We want to stop species getting to a country. But when they're here, we also need to consider their management to reduce the impacts that they have on our native species. And our response has both been setting these things at a global, on a global stage, so using the IPBES process, the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also the IUCN and their frameworks that they set out for management of species, and the EU and their union list of species of concern, of which the grey squirrel is one. Steve talked about the number of extinctions caused by threats such as alien invasive species. And the plot here on the left is some recent work from our research group, which is actually showing the extinctions prevented from some of these threats. And you'll see for both birds and mammals, there have been a number of extinctions prevented through conservation action. So threats posed by invasive species that have been prevented from causing extinctions. So this work is due to be published shortly, and you can find an early view online. We've also seen the plot on the right already, talking about the invasion curve and the rapid increase of population size of an invasive species and the associated increase in control costs as the area invaded expands. And our response changes in a reflection of the size of the population and the impacts that that population is having. So we've looked at this from the other angle, from looking at not just the invasion process, but how to turn that round and manage the population and how to reduce the impacts within perhaps tolerable thresholds. So it might be that we're wanting to prevent the species from getting to a particular area. It might be a protected area. It might be a red squirrel stronghold. We might also be looking to fully eradicate or to completely eliminate the impacts of a species. Now, we've been sort of successful, well, we have been quite successful with this, with where invasive species have been removed from islands. Especially species such as rats, which can be poisoned, and it then becomes a relatively straightforward process of distributing traps, the poison lure or the bait, through a gridded network of traps to cover the entire spatial area. Now you can imagine that This becomes more challenging as the size of an island increases, or indeed if you start working on an area that's not an island. So this is just some examples. On the right is the eradication of the rats from the Shiant Islands to promote seabird recovery. An example from Canada where they've distributed the poison across a grid network. And some of the challenging landscapes within which this is technically feasible. We'll hear later about the Stoke project in Orkney, but it's also possible to look at eradicating larger mammals than rats, or similar sized mammals that you're not laying a poison down for, that you're killing with a trap. And you can apply the same sort of methodology. And recently I saw this a screenshot of a dashboard from New Zealand where they have all of their data online and they can see real time where the traps are active and where they need to the next apply their management action. So this is the sort of thing that we can aspire to with grey squirrel management. However, it's challenging because we don't really have any experience of eradicating a mammal from this sort of size of landscape. This plot here shows the area of eradication and the amount of effort in terms of input, man effort in this case, or person effort, into these eradications. The black dots indicate the eradications that have been successful, and the open ones are failed mammal eradications, and the ruddy duck eradication from the UK is on there for information about how that went as well. So we know a bit about eradicating species from islands, and we can actually look at a similar thing for looking at managing to a boundary, where similar to what we're doing in the Ulster are doing in the Mournes area, where they're managing the squirrels to the geographic limits of the mountain range. And we see the same thing with mink in northern Scotland, where they are being managed within a geographical area and treating that as an island. So if you can manage the boundaries, that you will constantly have to apply some effort to maintain that boundary around your area that is free of an invasive species. But we don't really have a huge amount of information to go on if we're managing in widespread invasive species. And we need to learn more about what sort of strategies we should implement and which sort of strategies are most effective. And we have a responsibility to do this, and to do this well, both to our funders, but also to the wider public. If we're talking about and promoting killing animals, we need to be sure that we can justify the need for that to happen. So we need to be able to evidence that the action that we're undertaking is actually of benefit and what those benefits are. And that's what we've been trying to do through this project. So I'm going to talk about the challenges of managing widespread invasive mammals. And one of the first challenges is defining what your management strategy is. So these are the main project areas from the RSU project that were funded under the LIFE component of the programme. And what we've done is looked at the main management objective in terms of where the population was perceived to be in terms of abundance. So for the Red Squirrels Trust Wales, the density and population abundance of the grey squirrel is deemed to be the highest across all the project areas. And really they're looking to reduce that, initially to reduce that population to get to a point where they could then start to look to eradicating the grey squirrels. In Kielder, the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, and in Merseyside with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, they're looking to reduce the impacts. So either spatially, to keep the squirrels out of a particular forest or out of a reserve, or looking to reduce the competition between the two species across areas where the two co-occur. Ulster Wildlife Trust in the Mournes area, we're looking for complete removal. And as you can see along the bottom of the curve diagram there, the strategy employed changes here. So instead of targeting control to particular woodlands, they're looking at responsive control. So where a grey squirrel is seen, the through passive surveillance, this is acted upon in a very targeted method. So in North Wales, where the strategy was initially to reduce the density, the management was carried out over a very widespread area. And you can see here the distribution of captures in the top plots, in the orange ones, and the distribution of the trapping effort in the bottom plot. So it's very widespread and fairly consistent across the different project years. Within year, you can see that in the plot on the right, that the effort number of trapping sessions through the year changes, slightly with more happening in the summer, and this might be a response to the environmental conditions. And this is the sort of information we're trying to tie together with the analysis that we were doing. The plot here on the right is showing the Merseyside area. And this is an area where we're looking to reduce the impact of the grey squirrels on the reserve, which is the orange, the area highlighted in orange, where the red squirrels at Formby are. And here the landscape is very different. We've got very patchy woodlands. So some areas where we've got woodlands and then urban areas, and then a lot of arable land as well. And what we saw here was that while there was only one ranger in this area, so a less resource and very split between where the activity was focused, we also saw a change in the methods that were used. So we saw in the autumn months, we saw some trapping, and then in the winter months through January through April, the methodology switched to shooting. So understanding these differences and the effectiveness of the different methods also helps us think about planning. Another challenge of widespread invasive species control is engaging communities and stakeholders. Now, we've heard a bit about this already, and I just wanted to illustrate the other two project areas. So in Ulster, where we have the response being very targeted to where sightings have occurred, and in Kielder, where the early warning system is in place. Now, to have both of these systems working to their fullest, we need to understand things like how long it takes to capture a squirrel after seeing it. You know, if you see us, I'm get some laughs there. So it takes, you know, we need to know what that time frame is, because that's the resource that you're putting in to this stage of the project. And this is where citizen science can really help with some of the monitoring and the surveillance. In Kielder, having a system set up whereby you're not pulling rangers away from the activity that they're actually carrying out, and that you've got a different mechanism for responding to new sightings that are detected through this system is beneficial. The other method that we have for, or a topic we'd like to discuss in terms of community contributions, is the urban trap loan scheme. And I'm going to invite Esther up to talk about her project.
Can you hear me? Okay. So my objectives for dealing with doing this research was to describe how the volunteers are contributing to the grey squirrel control, and also to understand the motivations and experiences and the effectiveness of the trap loan scheme. So my study area was I used data from Merseyside and Mid Wales, and it was basically the volunteer data, which, as you know, almost everyone knows about the trap loan scheme. You must be aware, because some people have discussed about it. And in Merseyside, the locations where the the traps or the grey squirrel control occurs is within that boundary, the stronghold boundary, and in Mid Wales is in the buffer zone between those two areas. So The volunteers or gray squirrel control is more of a reactive basis where people report the sightings of gray squirrels, and then the volunteers go set the traps and being monitored, and then it's dispatched, and records are all kept. So to understand the motivation and experiences, I did send some structured questionnaires via email and post to some volunteers in both areas. And I didn't really base on when the volunteers joined the Traplon scheme. It's just whoever was participating in that scheme. And the data that was available for me to analyze from my society, it was from January 2013 to December 2019, and for Mid-Wales, it was from October 2016 to September 2019. So the results, from what I heard, there were 564 gray squirrels culled in Merseyside, and then 1803 culled in Mid-Wales, and 215 volunteers in Merseyside, with a total of 484 volunteering activities. And then those graphs shows how the gray squirrel, like the culled gray squirrel, were distributed over years. And in Merseyside, you can see that most gray squirrels were culled in 2015. And then in Mid-Wales, that first year, there was more culling than the preceding years. And these are the locations how it was distributed. And if you look at the Merseyside, I believe like the top location might have been, I think, messed up. I don't understand if that is part of, because I don't know much about the location. So if that is not in Merseyside, then And then you can see that before the RSU funding and after, like you can see that there has been expanding of the gray squirrel culling. The areas have extended from when the funding came in, which means more reporting was made, or maybe there were more of awareness, more people were aware, started becoming aware of it, and then reported it. And then in Mid-Wales, it just shows how the spread was. So this is almost the same as the other one for gray squirrels culled, but it's more of just when the volunteers were more. But I believe they follow almost the same trend, because when more gray squirrels are reported, then more, it goes alongside with the gray squirrels reported. And this graph shows that more culling of gray squirrels occurred between September and November, and some in June. And also, the majority of the volunteers, or most volunteering activity, occurred in October. So for Merseyside represented 23.8% of all the trapping activity, and then Mid-Wales 76.17. And so, like I told you, more in summer, autumn, where most gray squirrels were culled, and I related it to the distribution of the juveniles, and also maybe to such a food, variety of food. And then Traplon scheme seemed to have a more good volunteering recruitment and retention because in Midwells, the number of volunteers were maintained above 100 for the all years, and in Merseyside, then from the first year to the second year to the third year, the numbers of volunteers increased, and the number of volunteers did not come below the one recorded in the second year, which means there has been some retention of those volunteers and also increase of more coming of volunteers. So most volunteers who responded expressed their motivation is saving the red squirrels. And they were from different experiences. And one volunteer mentioned that he understood the crisis that the red squirrel was before, and that's why it decided to volunteer and to save the red squirrel. So in terms of improvements, I might not have mentioned what the questionnaires covered, but it covered the motivation. I asked, why are you motivated? What are the benefits? What are challenges? And what are the improvements that you would like to see? And these are some of the improvements that people mentioned, like they would like to see, they would like to access the data or the maps of where these activities happening, the gray squirrels, and also, I think you can see. I don't want to read all of them, sorry. So in conclusion, Traploan scheme is really good initiative in helping the UK control their gray squirrels. And engaging the volunteers is great. It's very important because also it helps in accessing the private lands and Thank you.
So we can see there are lots of issues and ways in which the citizen science can play a big role in both the control but also in the monitoring of the conservation action. I'd just like to finish up just by talking about the evidence and the benefits that come off from the types of projects that we're carrying out. And we'd like to think about this in terms of adaptive management and learning from our experience of managing grey squirrels. So we have this process, this modelling framework that we can use where we can understand what's going on with the control and the removal of the squirrels, but also understand what's going on with the population that is remaining. And to do this properly, we need to know where the control effort is, but also monitor both the reds and the greys in the remaining project areas. And this diagram, again, the same one from Merseyside, highlights this, where the black and orange dots are from the sites where the rangers went to, and the green dots are the red squirrel sightings that we would not have got was it not for the monitoring data that comes in from the public sightings. But as you can see, there are still some gaps in the landscape, and actually we don't know whether there are reds or greys in those areas until somebody goes to look for them. And we have this problem across many of the project areas, not knowing necessarily where there are red or grey squirrels. So the data that have come from this project has helped us understand the trapping densities that are used across the different landscapes, across the different project areas. And this diagram just shows how that varies depending on the project partners, which is a reflectance of the environment and the landscape within which they are working. And to sum up, what we've learned from this project is that landscape is very important. We need to understand the role of connectivity between different woodlands, between wider areas, and how different squirrel groups could then work together to achieve greater action across a larger landscape. We need to understand the role of individuals in carrying out the control and whether they are using similar protocols or similar methodologies, and if there's ways that we can learn from each other. together. And we also need to look at integrating monitoring with our control data. So when we're designing the next projects, as Heinz was just telling us about, we really need to look at ways in which we're incorporating both the control data in terms of the removals and how many squirrels are being removed from which areas, but also with monitoring of the remaining invasives, but also of the impact that they are having, so the benefits to the red squirrel conservation. And that is something we could do much better at. And there'll be a publication coming out summarising all of this, which we'll make sure is on the RSU website. Okay, thank you.